Hello and welcome to VHTB, your guide to the talent, culture, and finance side of the space startup ecosystem. My name is Justus Kilian. Excited to be back with you for this great conversation. I'm a partner at Space Capital. I'm joined by Matt Gjertsen of Better Everyday Studios. How you doing, Matt?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Justus?
Awesome. Good to be back here. And Brian Mejeur of AdAstra Talent Advisors. How you doing, Brian?
Fantastic. Excited to be here.
Awesome, guys. Well, today we are going to be kicking off a three-part series that really came to us as feedback from one of the founders in the Space Capital portfolio. The topic is going to be navigating the Valley of Death. What we found is that the Valley of Death isn't necessarily understood by founders or investors. Like even at a definitional level, there's some sort of lack of clarity in what it really is. And so we're going to break this conversation into three parts, starting with sort of the early onset of entering into that sort of the challenges of the Valley of Death, the middle phase and the late phase, and what it means for the company, across our sort of respective areas of expertise. So we're going to start out by sort of kicking off some of the early definitions, and then we're going to dive into it. So what is the Valley of Death? The way I've looked at this is it really is that gap from building that first prototype or, doing an on-orbit demonstration to actually scaling it into a repeatable business model, where there's a healthy set of unit economics. And so going from 1 to 10 to sort of 50 is typically what I look at it as. But I want to pause there, guys. Have you heard of any like a different set of definitions? How do you guys think about this?
Yeah, for me, this reminds me of first time I was exposed to an idea like this was when I was working at an early stage software company. And I think before I started, they were like, you got to read this book, Crossing the Chasm. And so it was a similar idea of like, okay, we're going to get to this stage where we think we're onto something. We think we can do it, but also like no one's just writing us. Like we don't have consumers just paying us tons of money to sustain our business. And it's going to be painful, but we got to like, how do we get across this chasm? So that was probably my first exposure to it. And then also like reflecting back on being at SpaceX and like hearing the story of the early days and picturing like these first Falcon 1 launches and just like how painful it must have been. You had these like people who wanted to believe in you and give you money, but also not enough to just sustain the business. And the company almost died like many times, right? So that like SpaceX barely got through the Valley of Death. And so I think it may be a good example.
I think it's a great example. And I think from my perspective, I actually learned about it very similar to, kind of initial definition. I first heard about it in the military. I will never forget a conversation I had when I first started working at Space Systems Command. This was several years ago. And I was talking to somebody who is, part of SpaceWorks and all the different programs that are trying to bring people bring commercial entities, startups into the government. And I'll never forget this guy. He's like, look, if somebody came up to me and they put a working lightsaber on the table and said, I can build this, we wouldn't know what to do next. Because like the government contracting and procurement is such a challenging thing. That's where it's just, there's so many things to it from from a company side. The crossing the Valley of Death it's the people, it's the processes, it's the systems that you put in place. But then on the other side of it, in the U.S. government, it's the contracting, it's finding the right funding mechanisms and all that kind of stuff. So I'm really excited that we're breaking it up into these 3 episodes because I think there are so many different components.
If I may, I'm curious, like that was really useful, Matt, to hear kind of, especially some of the government perspective. If you were just looking at like a venture-backed company or companies, what like stages would you say are typically most associated in deep tech with the Valley of Death? Like when are they maybe most likely entering it? Is it Series A and then when are you hoping they're out of it?
It depends on how expensive it is to build that initial prototype.
Yep.
And so, but I'd say like a Series A to Series B is probably generally acceptable. When we look at space tech, you can typically with like a pre-seed and seed round raise enough capital now to put an on-orbit demonstration together.
Yep.
And that is, I think, sort of when you're going from like designing and prototyping and building that first object, to then actually figuring out who are the customers that are going to buy these and how are we going to repeatably deliver this at scale. And that's where I think that initial valley of death begins. But it makes sense. So, Matt, you started to lead us down a really interesting sort of additional definitional path, which is why the valley of death occurs. And so starting with government procurement, like I think that was a really natural place because the government procurement process, whether it be DoD or NASA, they have their own valley of death structurally, right? The SBIRs, phase 1, phase 2, didn't historically have a bridge into those larger sort of contracts, whether it be a phase 3 or a program of record. And so I know recently in the last couple of years, AFWorks and SpaceWorks have tried to build this sort of interim contract mechanism called a TACFI or a StratFi. Some of them have matching contributions to it from investors. And so this is meant to help bridge to a more sort of commercial or larger scale commercial contract within the government. And so I think that like even that coining of the Valley of Death could have came out of that government procurement process. I do think that there's two other sort of structural areas that are worth highlighting why this happens. One is just purely around the way that deep tech financing currently exists in the market. So capital is abundant sort of at the ends, right? There's quite a bit of early stage formation capital that's willing to back great founders, great talent, taking on an ambitious idea. And so you can raise that, $5, $10, $20 million to build your initial prototype. And then there's a lot of growth capital out there that's willing to underwrite a company once they have significant customers and proven revenue and a pathway to scale. But it's that real sort of in-between area that can range anywhere from maybe $20 million to $200 million in additional growth capital that, can be really challenging. And then simultaneously in the business, that's the phase where you're experiencing a lot of CapEx as you're starting to build out your early sort of manufacturing process and so on. And your operations, the complexity of the operations is stepping into sort of a whole new level of scaling. And so you're going from one satellite to, tens of satellites, launch, ground, enterprise go to market, government go to market. And so the complexity of the organization just balloons at that phase. So hopefully that ties it together and gives us some definitional understanding of what we're looking at. So the early phase, I wanted to lean into this and just go into what I would define as sort of the first step. And so this is all about like entering in. You've just closed, your seed round. You're moving towards building that initial prototype. I would say that the early phase is all about planning and preparation. You're still riding high because you've got money in the bank, and it creates space and opportunity to actually proactively think and put a foundation in place about what's to come before the gears really start to grind. And so that's where I was going to sort of focus on this. The first thing is really sort of what to do. And I think that this touches on all of our respective aspects. And it's anchoring the business to a long-term vision. You're going to be so dependent on government contracts and the different opportunities that are available to you to leverage non-dilutive capital. But your investors are going to be coming to you on a belief and a vision for a much bigger, longer-term idea that's going to try to transform an industry. And so you have to anchor a business to the long-term vision. Shaheen at Lux likes to sort of warn about chasing revenue too early for these companies. That distracts from the bigger company vision. It can actually create a widening of the gap because you're not hitting the right proof points to actually show you can build something at scale. And so it really, from my perspective, is all about ensuring you select the right team and you build the culture that is looking for the longer term vision. And then the contracts that you take on, you're ensuring that you're buying down technical risk that fits into this bigger vision and saying no to the things that are a little bit more tangential. But I want to get your guys' thought around that sort of initial idea of anchoring the business in the long-term vision and how you build culture and how you recruit around that.
I was really intrigued by what you said there around this idea of, not being distracted and anchoring to a core idea. Because I think, at least in the companies and the folks that I've talked to, so when I work with companies, usually it's actually companies that are much later, but I still am talking to a lot of folks who are, maybe they're 5-person companies or whatever. And one of the most common conversations I have with them or hear them is they have some idea for a thing that they think will transform the world, but it's going to take them a decade to do, or there's not, and they're always asking like, okay, how do we make this, especially say it's a space company, how do we make this terrestrially relevant? Like, how can we build a product that can be useful here? And that all of a sudden, like, makes them go in all kinds of different directions that maybe it sounds good, but it's not necessarily advancing them, and is just like adding a whole bunch of complexity often. At least that's what I've seen. Because the thing that I find most interesting about this is the story sounds really good. Like the idea of bringing in revenue earlier sounds really good, but at least from what I hear you saying, and I think from what I've seen, is it winds up meaning that you're just kind of spinning your wheels and not actually making progress towards something specific. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. So there's companies that can use the SBIR and grant programs available to develop specialized technology and get paid for doing it that's relevant to their longer term product vision and product roadmap.
Yeah.
And then there's companies that end up specializing in just sort of that research and development and ultimately hold a broad set of patents and a portfolio of IP, but none of it's really scalable. And so in that version, the business outcome is somebody just finds a unique set of IP and they just want to acquire it from you. And you're just sort of hoping that you have a broad enough portfolio to create a good business. The other is very intentionally, strategically building your IP and your technology and getting paid to do it in a direction that supports the bigger vision of the company. And you brought a really interesting point where there's a lot of like space companies, particularly folks that are doing stuff that are a little bit farther out, thinking about the moon or, Mars or things like that. And, there isn't a market for that, but there is R&D funding to actually give them the opportunity to build a unique sort of set of IP and moat around it. And so I personally really like these businesses because there's a nice circularity in terms of how the business can actually be built, where early on, you look at space as a very early entry point in market to create credibility and value and de-risk some of the hardest technical challenges that you have. And if you can go actually, put a rover on the moon and show that you're able to do that, the systems of autonomy, survivability, communications, operating in GPS denied environments, like those factors that you built for the moon are directly relevant to the mining industry, the energy industry, where you need to send robots into harsh, extreme, uncertain environments, first responders. And so if you can actually find that circularity, it can actually be a really thoughtful and interesting business.
It's all but it sounds like it's just all comes down to kind of the rigor with which you're doing that analysis of making sure, no, this is still on our path. This does still fit our vision, and not just chasing near-term cash, kind of
giving you an advantage versus distracting you. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and if you're just chasing the near-term cash, you'll end up building a team to chase that near-term cash. And if it's not on the path you're trying to go to, maybe in a year or two, you're now maybe skipping ahead a little bit here, but like now you have this team, and what are you going to do with this team? And now cash is maybe not as plentiful. So I think that this is a key topic to be aware of. This is, your early team, you're scrappy, you're hungry, you're hiring builders and people who thrive in this like scarce environment to be able to go deliver something. And now you can raise a nice chunk of capital to go to cross the valley. It might be like really tempting to hire a big team and kind of chase like, oh wow, we have this like multi-million-dollar contract. We could go win with the people we have. We could hire those people and go do it. But like, I think the real exercise of like good leadership to be able to get through this is knowing what direction is the right direction and only hiring the right people on that path and trying to keep your team as lean as possible, like stepping into this this phase.
And it can get really sophisticated when, you start out the company, you probably haven't had a lot of ability to influence, the research agenda of the government and try to help shape some of those SBIR topics, right? And so you sort of have to take what's available, and it could be pretty left of center from what you're trying to build. And, then you hire for people to be able to deliver on that. It takes you down a different path. If you're able to stay true to that direction early on, you bring on that talent, you get one or two SBIRs that are aligned, then you're able to bring in some, government go-to-market person who can help shape some of the future topics that are very aligned to what you're trying to build. And then you can have a more proactive method in sort of shaping the directionality of it. But early on, it's very tough. And so you have to be very clear on like, this is what we're doing. And, we may say no to short-term revenue. We need to have investors that are aligned to that. We need to have sufficient capital on the balance sheet to be able to do that, because it risks sending you down a path that is not validating the technical risks you're trying to do or demonstrating your unit economics or showing any core functions of the business. But it is a business, right? You have revenue coming in. It's just not a sustainable business that you're building towards a long-term vision.
Yeah, Justus, do you think that most investors are sophisticated enough to know the difference here? That to see that a company coming to you and be like, look at all these SBIRs we won, look how great we are, versus we won one or two SBIRs, but they're the one or two we wanted. They're the only one or two we wanted. Are most investors savvy enough to see that maybe company number two is actually a more investable company in the long run?
The decision to invest isn't entirely based on the quality of the near-term pipeline, right? It could be really about the long-term vision, and people get really excited about that. It's a tough question. I would say that investors are increasingly becoming sophisticated about the value of SBIRs and the need to use them thoughtfully. Previously, investors would largely discount SBIRs to almost zero because the pathway to scale those into programs of record were very limited. But through the TACFI, through the StratFi, through the increasing number of startups that are winning programs of record, these are now very viable pathways of growth. And so, investors are starting to flex that muscle and bring on folks from that world that are more sophisticated in the procurement process. And I think there is a higher level of scrutiny into terms what are you doing, seeing how the company has planned to move through those unique phases. People are getting more sophisticated. Yeah. I think one of the challenges is you have a lot of investors that have primarily invested in enterprise SaaS now moving into deep tech investing, and they don't have the right expectations around the length it takes, the time to revenue. And so you're looking for different multiples here. It's not, your CAC to LTV. It's not, daily active user. It's just very different metrics. And so measuring what matters when there isn't revenue, in a deep tech company is important.
Yeah, and I think what you're touching on also highlights a trend that we've seen a lot in the talent marketplace over the last 2 years is the shift towards government being a form of business of validation, and even before that, do you have the right person on the team who can go capture the right business for you? So we've seen a really strong surge in demand over the last 2 years for these head of business development, head of government partnerships types of things right around this stage too. And so it's definitely feels like this dichotomy or push-pull where you see that the importance of it and there is a path there, but also you don't want to get too pulled into it. And so it's fascinating to see.
When I hear that also sounds to me like more of a sophistication within the industry as well, developing of a realization that it's not just about making the product and now we're good. And now, and now we got a product, we got a demo, and now we know we're going to get a contract because it works. It's no, you still have to work the contracts, you still have to work the partnerships, you still have to find your way in. Like getting to one is just the beginning, and that's just the beginning of this whole valley. And so you have to continue to work in order to get across it.
I think that's right. Okay, so moving from that, sort of anchoring the vision of the company, understanding where you're going and rowing in the same direction, ensuring all your key stakeholders are aligned, including the board, your investors, the team that you hire. Then I think there's an opportunity to start to, for the executive team to start to build an understanding of the financial tools that they have at play to navigate this extended period where your resources are going to be constrained. And so I've made a list of what I think are some of the tactical sort of options that folks have available, and I put them in order of priority. So first, contact that you go to when you need money, and it should be your existing investors. And this goes to what we were just saying. You should be selecting investors for a familiarity with deep tech and their understanding of the long procurement cycles. And as a result, they should have a plan in terms of how they manage reserves and how they follow on, and how they can be a helpful partner to you over these extended periods. Just to give you one example, like these very large multi-stage firms that are now increasingly investing in deep tech, they've built their firms to be able to be, a lead investor from like Series A all the way through Series D if need be. And so it's an interesting and helpful value proposition to founders to say, hey, like I know that if I'm making progress and I have, milestones to back it, like I've got a balance sheet and an investor behind me that can keep backing me as we're sort of going down this deep tech path. But there aren't many of them. I think that there needs to be, more investors that have specialization, that have those balance sheets to provide it. So as a founder, you should be asking this of your investors. You should understand what their reserve and follow-on strategy are, because, they're the first person you're going to hit up when you need, extra capital. Next is non-dilutive sources that we've talked about. You really need to develop your understanding of all of these different contracting methods. And like we said, there's an increasingly sophisticated marketplace here to sell into. The Space Force set up a nonprofit organization called The Bridge. It's based in El Segundo. It's meant to help companies navigate this contracting method. It's not enough on its own. A great place to start. Customers prepaying for proof of concept or early sort of milestone payments. This is a hugely positive thing. If you can actually get your customers to prepay for anything, that's going to get investors excited. An incredibly powerful tool to be able to leverage, and could actually be, money in the bank. So when you think about contracting mechanisms and milestone payments, if you can build this in, that's absolutely amazing. Equipment financing and venture debt. There's a variety of flavors of debt. The things that you just should know right off the top of the head. Raising venture debt, you need to do it in conjunction with closing that seed round. And like the bank is going to be underwriting, the balance sheet of your investors. So, your ability to bring in an extra couple million has to happen at that point of closing. And it depends on the investors that you've chose. And when it comes to using debt to finance PP&E, property and plant and equipment, you should try to do this as soon as it's economically viable. Using equity to do this is hard, but you have to have some revenues coming in. And so this happens, relatively early in this valley of death. And so it can be an important life source as you need to scale manufacturing. There are providers out there. And then lastly, strategic equity from, maybe primes or somebody like that. But you should really only do this, if it accelerates your contracting process speed or the ability to distribute, much larger. So those are some of the tools. I just wanted to make sure that they were available. Guys, does anything come to mind when we talk through those different sources that might be able to help companies plan and finance themselves?
The other thing that comes to mind for me is, both of these discussions is it's just, especially early on, is it's all about discipline and clarity of, which I think can be difficult in the early stages because like we talked about before the show, you just closed this round. You just created this demo. You just like it feels like all the roads are paved and you're just, green lights to Malibu. But that's exactly when you need to be the most cautious and be the most clear about what you're trying to achieve. And then when you do need money, knowing how you're going to get resources in the future, because though it feels great now, it's not going to last forever in this kind of environment, with the kinds of problems that people are trying to solve.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I also think that, there's a bit of a culture around the excitement of winning these government contracts or raising these like big rounds of venture capital, but there are other avenues to other forms of funding. And I think especially if you're a first time founder, you might not know of these, but you sure as hell better have good partners who do and can direct you to them, because if other people on your cap table, like they don't want to be diluted for no reason either. So like, let's get the right strategic partners on your cap table early so that you can explore these other avenues that are not as in the limelight compared to venture and government. So I think those are some key areas for folks to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think that's great. A lot of these things are relational. When you have money and you don't need money, that's the best time to start building relationships with some of these players and providers, understanding their needs, getting closer to the pain points and understanding when they invest and how they invest. And, when you're structuring contracts, you need to be proactive in trying to negotiate those milestone payments. So it is like, these tools are available, but they're only available to you if you know them ahead of time when you don't need them. Because when you actually need them, you wouldn't have built the relationships, you wouldn't have known what to ask. And so then your back's going to be up against the wall. So that's why the planning and preparation is so important.
Yeah, and I thought you were just going to say there, like the best time to raise money is when you don't need it too.
It's true.
So I think like really like the planning is also vital in that case. Like I don't think investors are excited to be the check that keeps you alive. They want to be the check that like fuels your growth and just gives you extra runway, and knowing when to strike when the iron is hot, whether it's in terms of like the marketplace being hot or the timing is right for your company. But I think that's another key piece, and like have a healthy bank account entering the valley.
Yeah. So to wrap this up, I think what we're trying to do here in that planning and preparation phase is to build a bridge to commercialization, right? And getting an understanding of how you can use, you have a long-term vision of where you're going, how you can use, government contracts to move from phase 1 to phase 2 to TACFI to program of record, and what that looks like, and getting very detailed and building that muscle, understanding, mapping out the color of the money and the budget year timing, and making sure that that's, built into your process, and being able to communicate those things, starting to like develop secure written commitments for matching funds, because the StratFi comes with, requirement that you go out and get industry capital. And so you're planning, you're preparing, you're building sort of the muscle memory and the relationships to be able to, use these capabilities when that time starts to show up. And then, it's actually moving to implementation. And this is where, it's a function of hiring the right people when, now you're starting to hit the grind and trying to actually make this a reality and move from one demo to, multiple craft or multiple capabilities. And you got to have the right people to do that and make sure that they're all mission aligned. So that's what we're going to be transitioning into the next episode. Appreciate everybody's insight on this one. Hopefully it gives you at least a foundation to build your playbook as you go into the Valley of Death. Thanks for joining us.